So there tends to be this kind of ongoing trend that I tend to see on a lot of videos and live streams, and basically like a lot of people within the Beatles sphere, if you could call it that, um, where people tend to downplay and downright dismiss Paul McCartney's outputs during the 80s, saying that Paul McCartney in the 80s was kind of like a time for him to find himself, coming out of Wings and everything. But truthfully, I really dig everything that Paul did during the 80s. I feel like that as someone who loves to doing like a lot of experimentation, that Paul utilized, everything that was going on in the 80s to experiment with so many different sounds, which is something that a true artist does, and the beauty thing about the 80s was like, there's like so many sounds going around. You had like the new wave, you had the new romantics kind of stuff, you have some type of the dance stuff that was happening and everything. And so it was a great time for Paul to finally like, like let me let the kind of like the weird side of me run free and during this decade and stuff like that. And he did that perfectly. He did that so perfectly, going from the McCartney 2 album straight into Flowers in the Dirt. And so I for this video and stream, I really want to talk about each and every album, give like a little history of every album, plus my introduction to every album as well. So the first album I'm going to talk about is McCartney 2. Now, this album was not supposed to be a true kind of like McCartney album. Everything that he did on this, it was basically just him experimenting. Like I said, he loves to experiment with stuff. So he even like, even before the sessions that he did for that will become the McCartney 2 sessions, he was always doing experimenting at his studio in Scotland, which was known as Root Studio. And he would come out with some type of quirky stuff, like, Boyle Crisis, what's the corduroy, how you like the lyrics, and Unbelievable Experience, and all this kind of other stuff, and some of that stuff that was writing around that time will later on appear on future stuff like Wanderlust. Um, and so when it came to this, he basically, wanted to do some more experimentation with 16 track. So he borrowed a 16 track machine from EMI, and only on the basis that he just wanted to like, spend like about a few weeks, at a studio in Scotland, and just making demos, stuff that was for his entertainment only. But when he played it to some friends, and they basically told him like, "There's your next album," and he wasn't thinking about making another McCartney album. He really wanted to, um, if anything, his sights was still on Wings. He was still doing Wings at the time of recording the album. He was still promoting Back to the Egg, and he was getting ready to do a new tour in 1980. But it became the thing where he did basically, his friends basically said, no, these recordings, you need to make like another McCartney album. This could be McCartney 2. And so he ran with it. He ran with all those recordings, and he put out this album. Now I got introduced to this album during 2002. I just remember being at a swap meet in San Diego, and I remember finding it on cassette. It was those crappy Columbia Records cassettes. Anything that's from that was made by Columbia Records totally sucked. They sounded terrible. And so when I first heard the cassette, like, I only knew Coming Up, and I heard the studio version because I remember seeing the promo video on TV when they're promoting Wingspan. And so I just remember hearing the cassette tape, I was like, okay, there's coming up. But then when I start to hear the other stuff on it, I was like, what is it I'm hearing? I'm not liking what I'm hearing. What is this temporary secretary and all this? It got to the point where I just didn't want to listen to the rest of the cassette. I was like, okay, that's I'm never gonna dig into that again. But I think about a couple years later, or during around that time, I was doing home recordings, and then I found myself basically doing what he was doing on McCartney too. I was experimenting with sounds. I had a couple of tape machines that I was experimenting with here in this room and making these kind of like funny little recordings. And I realized, you're basically doing what McCartney too is. And so I end up getting the album again, but this time it was on CD. It was released by Capitol Records, and then I decided to like, okay, I'm gonna listen to this whole thing all the way through, and when I did, I ended up finding myself really loving it. I actually did find myself really gravitating towards Temporary Secretary. That's a possibly like my favorite track on the album. I love that song so much. And then I got into like the other songs, like On the Way. I remember hearing Waterfalls in my youth, so I like that one. And then Frozen Parlor, Dark Room, One of These Days. And I realized like this is like a really, really good album. And then I just remember like a year later finding this at a Beatles convention in San Diego, and it's the Lost McCartney album. And then hearing some of the stuff that didn't make this album, um, I end up liking as well. I like, Mr. H. Adam, All You Horse Riders, and Blue Sway, Boogie Wobble. And I was like, okay, I'm really loving what he did on this album. Um, so I say like, this is like a really nice introduction to, like some of the interesting stuff that we would hear from McCartney going forward into the 80s. And if I would have to rate this album, I probably would give this album a possibly like a 7 out of 10. I still love it. Something that I put on when I want to get experimental and stuff, or is in that kind of headspace. But I love it. It's a great album. The next album that he did afterwards is Tug of War, which was released in the year that I was born, 1982. And this was supposed to have been a new Wings album, because he was doing production on this during I want to say from July to October 1980. He was doing like a lot of sessions. I think not entirely in Montserrat, but in England, at Air Studios, which was George Martin's studio. But then the tragedy happened, which was John Lennon's passing, and he halted production. And then when he came back to work on it about 2 months later, he basically broke up Wings, and then this became solely McCartney, the a de facto first McCartney solo album after disbanding Wings. And so he, like, he worked with George Martin, and then he started to continue working with Denny Lane on this, as well as Linda, and then bringing in some new people, and then, like, working with Ringo Starr again, having him on the drums. You have Steve Gadd, and Stanley Clark. You had Andy McKay from Roxy Music playing on this as well, and as well as this collaborations with Stevie Wonder and Carl Perkins. I've heard this album. I think I probably listened to this album. First heard this album in 1998. It was a thing where I went to a Beatles fest, but this time it was in Los Angeles, and I bought it on a CD. It was like a Columbia CD, and listening it to front to back, it was like a great listen. I remember I knew some of the songs on this album beforehand. Of course, everybody knows Ebony and Ivory, which is like the big single off of this album. But then I also knew of Take It Away, which is one my favorite song on this album, Take It Away. And then I also knew Tug of War, because they played those videos on VH1, and I remember seeing them and I loving them. But then when I really listened to all the other stuff, I really liked what I was hearing. I loved Somebody Who Cares, What's That You're Doing Here Today, a beautiful tribute for John, um, Pound and Sinking, Dress Me Up as a Robber. Um, and so I have to say this is like a 9 out of 10 for me. Great album. I really, really love it. I will always go to this whenever I just want to, like, like play an album all the way through. It's like a really good album. Um, and during that time, he was still making like a lot of other stuff, because it was basically tug of war sessions. But he recorded so many stuff that some of the stuff had to go into like a next album. So all the good stuff went to tug of war, whereas all like the leftover stuff went into Pipes of Peace. And I have to say that um, this is a good album. Not a one that I totally gravitate to listen to, but it is a really good album because, again, he's working with Ringo Starr, Steve Gadd, Stanley Clarke, Andy McKay. But this time he's also working with, yeah, who I'm gonna say. I'm not gonna say his name, but you know who he worked with. Um, but some of the stuff that didn't make it to Tug of War, some of the stuff on here is really good. I like, well, Pipes of Peace is a really nice track. It's a really English. I really like that stuff. That's really English stuff. And then you have, like, The Other Me, Keep Undercover, So Bad, Sweet Little Show in Town, Average Person, and Through Our Love. Um, um, so in a way, this album, I give it like truthfully, I give it like a 5 out of 10. Maybe because I feel like the other half is not that interesting. Okay, I am gonna say it. Okay, it's now going into a 6 because I already have to say it. I do like The Man. Are you happy now? I'm saying it. I like The Man. It's a way better track than Say Say Say, even though Say 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 is kind of danceable, but The Man is a really good track. But it was some of the other stuff, like, some of the stuff inside too, that I just couldn't get into, like Hey 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 and Tug of Peace. Um, so yeah, that's Pipes of Peace. And I the way I got into this album was possibly a year. No, it's actually during 2002 as well. Same time I was introduced to McCartney too. I was introduced to this. Um, and I think it was a thing where I probably found the CD as well, and so I ended up buying it, listening to it. Um, yeah, Pipes of Peace. The next one is something that I've I was introduced to in 1995, and that is "Give My Regards to Broad Street." I was introduced to it because was able to finally see the film around that time. I remember getting the original VHS that was on CBS Fox, and watching it at home. Really loving everything about the film. A lot of the music numbers, the story. I love the story. It's a really good story, even though there's some parts I kind of don't get, but it is a movie that I do enjoy watching over and over again. I could watch it and never get tired of it. And same goes for the music. He's working with so many people on this thing. It's like, you have Dave Gilmour is back. You have Ann Dudley from Art of Noise, who does like a lot of work with Trevor Horn. You have his band in the film was Dave Edmonds, Chris Spedding from Roxy Music, and of course you have Eric Stewart of 10cc, who worked with Paul on Tug of War and Pipes of Peace. Ringo's back. Ringo's back on drums on this one, and you also have Linda on it, and then on the version of Steady Love Songs, he even brought out Louis Johnson to play on bass, and you have Steve Lukather and Jeff Porcaro from Toto playing on it. And even John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin is playing bass on Ballroom Dancing. And I have to talk about some of the songs on this. Like, my favorite song on this is Not Such a Bad Boy. Great performance. I love that song to death. And it was like one of those songs that I knew that once I started playing guitar again, I really wanted to learn, and I did. But some of the songs that he did on this album were songs that came from Tug of War, Pipes of Peace, and the songs that was done from those albums that was done on this, I prefer these versions better than the versions of Wanderlust and Ballroom Dancing that was on Tug of War. I prefer this version of So Bad more than the Pipes of Peace version. It just sounds more, has more like, strength behind it, behind the versions of this. And so with this, I do give this soundtrack I'll give it an 8 out of 10. I really do not gravitate to this all that much. I do have to say, no, it's good. It's good. It's good. I was gonna say something about Eleanor's Dream, but even on certain days, I love Eleanor's Dream, whereas there's some days that I just don't dig it. But yeah, it's really good. Like it's an 8 out of 10 for me. But in the next year, which is the next album I'm going to talk about, I just remember in the year 1996, I was at a Beatles fest in LA, and a guy next to me was selling some cassette tapes, and so I bought a cassette tape of another album I'm going to talk about later on, because I played my original to death, and so I needed to buy like a new one. So I ended up buying it, and then the guy that sold me the cassette tape was like, here, take this cassette tape as well. You might enjoy this one if you like this one. And so the cassette tape in question, an album in question, is Press to Play. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll take this. Like it looks interesting, and the cassette tape looked awesome and stuff. And so I remember, like, I didn't listen to it then and there. I waited till I got home here in India, and I had a cassette tape player, so I went home and I played it, put on my cassette tape, and make sure it was right around to the start. And then I just like, wow, this is a really good album. Every song on this album is great. Stranglehold, Good Times Coming, Talk More Talk, Footprints, Only Love Remains, Press, Move Over Busker, Angry. It was like, where has this album been in my life? And a little history about this album was like, this is Paul's first album back with Capitol after being with Columbia for quite some time. So it was issued here in America on Capitol. He was still being aired. All the stuff is still being issued on Parlophone. But this was like, this is like him trying to really dig into like the 80s sound, because he was working with Hugh Padgham, which Hugh Padgham is like one of my favorite producers. He worked with XTC, Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins, Genesis, The Police, Sting. He's one of my favorite engineers and producers, and so Paul did a great job working with him on this album, and as well as like co-writing like some of the songs on this with Eric Stewart. So this album, I really love it. People tend to knock it because people say like it's an 80s sounding album. That's why I like it. I like it because it sounds like the 80s, and I love the 80s growing up. I feel like it was like a really kind of majestic kind of time growing up, and especially around this era, 1986, 87, 88, 89, is like I just felt like that's when music was starting to become very, very nice and pretty all of a sudden, and stuff. Not knocking the early 80s stuff, but I felt like the second part of the 80s was like just beautiful, and this really really encapsulate, like the sound around that time that was going on, and so he was like, working with like a lot of other great people on this album. Like, you have Carlos Alomar, who is David Bowie's guitarist. You got Pete Townsend from the Who, and you even have Phil Collins playing drums on this. And then you have like Lenny Pickett and Eddie Radner, Eric Stewart, Ray Cooper, Dick Morrissey, Jerry Murata. You have a lot of really good. And then even when this you hear like the CD version of this album, you have three other great songs, which was Right Away, It's Not True, and Tough on a Tightrope. Um, and so this is like an album that I just totally, totally love to death. So this is an album that I do give a 10 out of 10 when I think about some of his best work. This is an album that I never get tired of. And also when I think about this album now, I think about my friend Kevin Reed, aka Beans. He passed away from cancer a couple of years ago. He loved this album. That's one of the things that we shared. And so I think about him when I hear this album now, such a great album. After Press to Play, people say like this is the time where he was trying to get back to basics and stuff like that. And after all the production that he went through with Press to Play. And so he decided to release an album specifically for the Russian um, people. And so what we got was Koba BCCP, aka back in USSR. And this is where he um, basically just sets himself like, with a four-piece band and started doing like rock stuff on this, like, and this is another album that I do give like, really good points to. Like, it's, he's first he's working with he decided to work with two sets of um of musicians. For one, like the on the first day he's playing bass, and so he's working with Mick Green playing guitar. You have his future drummer Chris Ritton. This was like his audition. He's playing on this, and then on the second day he takes over guitar. So you have Nick Garvey on bass, and you have Henry Spinetti on drums. And what we get is like solid rock um, renditions that he put on this album. I love my favorite song on this album is "Don't Get Around Much Anymore," and he also has like a lot of other solid moments in this, like Kansas City, 25 Rock, Lottie Miss Claudie, I'm in Love Again, Lucille. He rips it up on Lucille. Ain't That a Shame? Cracking Up. I love Cracking Up, Just Because, and Midnight Special. And the way I heard about this album, I was like a young kid, so I think I've heard this album possibly when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I think it was off of a bootleg CD that my dad had. Because this is like before it came out officially in America on Capitol. It was released on a bootleg CD that someone made of Melodica, of the Melodica release. And so this album I have to give like, a 9 out of 10. It's an album that I go to a lot. I love this. Possibly love this more than Run Devil Run. Um, then again, I think one of these days I need to listen to them both again and see which one comes out more on top. But I think in most cases is this one. I love it. And so we now come to the last album of the 80s. And I feel like this one really gets back into the sound, the Beatles sound, because during the time that he was making this album, Beatles CDs were coming out. Like this whole CD thing was happening, and so Capitol and Parlophone were putting out the Beatles standard UK albums on CD, and I think Paul was listening to like a lot of them and was like really really like remembering like all of how him and John worked on these albums, how how him and the other guys and George Martin were working on these Beatles music, and so that sort of like became like the spirit of this next album, and it was really great because he was also working with Elvis Costello, who Elvis Costello reminded Paul so much of John, because Elvis had like his kind of snarky um kind of remarks, same way as John did, and what came out of it was a very beautiful album, and it's my favorite, and it's my number one album, and that is Flowers in the Dirt. I'm even wearing the shirt. um, and out of all these albums that I've mentioned, this is the album that I truly do remember when it came out. Like I was 6, maybe 7 years old when it came out, and 7 or 8, no, 6, 7, and my dad. I just remember my dad coming home. He had the cassette, and he also brought with him the VHS, which was Put It There, which is him rehearsing with the guy, what will become his band during that time, and him going through all the songs and just really, really like loving every single song on this album. There's songs that it's like there's not a bad song on this album. There's not a bad song on this album. I love My Brave Face. My Brave Face totally reminds me of the Beatles. It could have been a Beatles song. I love Rough Ride, him working with Trevor Horn on that one. You Want Her Too, like, the duet with him and Elvis Costello. Distractions is very, very beautiful. And as well as We Got Married and Put It There. It's like pure McCartney. I love Figure of Eight and this one, Don't Be Careless Love. The New Orleans sound of That Day Is Done. Him going reggae with How Many People, and again going to the whole ballad thing with Motor of Love. And then if you had it on CD and cassette, you had Ue Le Sole, and even some like the B-sides that he was putting out on this album was really good, like The First Stone and Flying to My Home, The Loveliest Thing, and Good Sign. And plus, if you had bought like the tour pack, then you had Party Party. And so in this album, he got to work with like a lot of other new cast of great people: Phil Ramone, David Foster, Neil Dorson, Mitchell Froome, Trevor Horn, Stephen Lipson, Chris Hughes, and Ross Cullums, I think, and also beginning to work with what will become the guys of his band. Like Chris Whitten is back on this one, playing all the drums. You have Hamish Stewart from Average White Band, Robbie McIntosh from The Pretenders. The only person that is not on this album at this time was Paul Wicks Wickens, which he came in through Chris Whitten, because Chris Whitten and him, they both played on the Edie Brickell album, Shooting Rubber Bands at the Stars. So he was brought in during the touring preparations of this. But he was like totally on top with this album. It was like I never felt like when it came to his 80's stuff that he was sort of like waning. I felt like like he was still experimenting, and I felt like even like some of the most experimental stuff was like the best stuff that he was doing. And it really came to head with Flowers in the Dirt, and it's such a beautiful album. And this is like a totally a 10 out of 10 album for me. And and so I just want to end this by saying, like, I know people tend to look down at his 80s period because it is not Beatles. It's not sounding like Wings, because he developed a certain kind of sound with Wings that people really liked, because people really liked when he was going all rock and stuff. The stuff that he was doing on Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, That Speed of Sound, London Town, Back to the Egg. And the stuff that he did in 80's was totally not that. It was not Wings. This was Paul truly being true to himself, always experimenting with sounds. Um, Basically just making music for his own enjoyment. And and if there's people out there that liked it, he was happy about it. If there are things that people didn't like about it, then he was totally fine with that as well. um and so I appreciate that stuff. I appreciate that he was not afraid to break out into doing letting this weird side basically come out, as I said earlier in this thing. Not being afraid to like let his weird side happen. And so I feel like people really need to reevaluate a lot of this stuff and give it a second chance. um and you might find that you'll love it. And I'll just say that like I really don't want to say it that much because I wanted to bash on the 90's, but I really do not want to bash on the 90's that much because I know that he was not as productive in the 90's because he was doing the anthology stuff, and plus what was going on with Linda, with her cancer, like in remission and coming back. But in the 80's he was still being very, very productive. He wasn't that productive in the 90's, but that was by design. But his 80's stuff was really interesting, like, and I feel like people really need to reevaluate a lot of the stuff that he did in the 80's. And I'm pretty sure that you will find that like these were really, really great music that he was making. So what do you think? Like, let me know what stuff that you did like of the 80's. I like to know about that. And so thank you so much for tuning in. This is something I've been wanting to make for quite a while. So have a great one.